So if you have a few cents in a bank account, or overpaid a credit card and there's a few cents there, or a couple of dollars in a stock trading account or crypto account or whatever, and that company is registered in Delaware, that so-called abandoned property, because after a few years that money is declared legally abandoned, that reverts to the state of Delaware. And states do various things with those. Most of them hold it in a separate account and look for the people who actually own the money, but Delaware just spends that money, and that's a nice $500 million a year business for Delaware, abandoned property. So all of that taken together is considered to be the franchise. And as I say, financially, that is so important for Delaware, and it's important for Delawareans because it's estimated that Delawareans only pay about 50 cents on the dollar for every dollar of service they receive. So they call it, let me get my colors right, because I think it's so a red. Is that right? Red is Republican. So red taxing state. It's a red taxing state with blue spending. So every politician's dream: low taxes, high spending, and a lot of that is paid for with corporate fees.
I mean, the franchise tax as well. Can you talk about that as well? What that entails, and like essentially the tax that bridges the gap that you described there.
Yeah. So as I say, it's a pile them high and sell them cheap type business. High volume, costs a few $100s. We still have time if you want to create that corporation before the end of the podcast. But if we do it, we have to pay a fee, depending on how quickly we want to do it. And the fee that we would pay to set up a limited liability company, you've probably heard of those, right? Limited liability companies account for about 70% of all the companies that are set up in Delaware. And there are about 1,000 companies being set up every day in Delaware. So 700 of those, more or less, are limited liability companies on average. So the rest are what so-called, I mean, it's a little technical, but C corporations, like the big listed companies that were, the sort of, I was thinking of Bath and Body Works, these kind of, or whoever, the big MasterCards and everyone else. They are C corporations. They pay higher fees, but most of what's set up is a pretty low fee. In other words, a few $100s for the basic level of service. But if you aggregate all that up, it adds up to a significant amount of revenue for Delaware. Probably close nowadays to about $2 billion in fees alone, which for a small state like Delaware is extremely significant. And as I say, add in all these adjunct source streams of revenue, you get to about 40% of the state budget. And they really have, as I said earlier, flipped the script. So Delaware collects more in corporate fees than 42 other United States collect in corporate taxes. So they have completely changed the model. Very innovative, not very easy to copy. There's several other states that would like to, like Nevada, but they haven't been able to. But they have completely flipped the script and made themselves financially much more secure. But having said that, if there's any sniff from regulators or the federal government that this might be shut down, it would be financially disastrous for Delaware.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about the relative proximity to New York and stuff, giving it an advantage. Delaware, close to DC as well, and that's, I guess, where we can move in a second. But I did want to ask you also about the preponderance of single-use LLCs. So this was something I wasn't aware of, right? I mean, you just talked about LLCs and how ubiquitous they are, how widely used they are. But I didn't even know that there's something where you can essentially, it's like a disposable LLC where you can use it one time and throw it away. And that exists in Delaware as well, if you don't mind talking a bit more about that.
And not just Delaware, to be fair, anywhere. I mean, it's like a plastic straw. You're absolutely right. So if you and I wanted to use our new LLC in Delaware to bring some money over from wherever, South America, we would do that transaction through using the LLC, and then we might decide we might basically abandon it. Next year we got to pay our fees again. We might decide we don't pay the fees. The challenge here, as an academic, because I am at University of Chicago, so I'm trying to approach this as a little bit an academic way and look for data. The challenge is there isn't a lot of data on single use versus repeated use, so we don't know. I have heard just anecdotally from my sources in Delaware that there's a lot of this single use, which makes sense because if we want to do a one-off transaction, we wouldn't necessarily want to use that LLC again. And because of the nature of limited liability, if we were to do an additional transaction, we might not want any fallout from the first transaction to affect the second. And that's often how limited liability is popular, exactly for that reason. I'll give you a more kind of prosaic example. I'm sure many of us have stayed at an Airbnb. Airbnbs increasingly are registered as single limited liability companies. And what you've probably experienced if you have stayed at an Airbnb is that you try and call the owner and there isn't an owner. It's a company in New Jersey or wherever, and they control 55 Airbnbs all over the country. And each one of them is an individual LLC. Now, one of the reasons I found out about that is because a little quirky thing that happens in Delaware, LLCs are so important to Delaware that in some places they are allowed to vote in elections. They are allowed to vote in special elections. So in Newark, Delaware, as they pronounce it locally, they had a special election. And they, under the rules that they have, each LLC can vote separately, which enabled one person to vote 31 times in that special election because they had 31 individual properties, each of them registered as a separate LLC. So this LLC thing is very widely used. And as far as I know, quite a lot of it is used as single use, which, as you say, for Delaware itself, means that they got to sell, which gives the whole industry a little bit of a Ponzi aspect to it.
So if I'm hearing you right, LLCs statutorily are allowed to vote in elections in Newark, Delaware? I just want to emphasize that again.
Special elections, yeah, and I write also in Rehoboth Beach, where our president has his second home. Yeah, the LLCs can vote, companies can vote because they're property owners. Think about it. The property is owned by an LLC. So just as an individual property owner might be able to register to vote, the LLC can vote in special elections, not in the... Now, there was a proposal, which is why I wrote about it, in Rehoboth Beach, which is the resort where lots of people from DC have summer homes, that there was a proposal in Rehoboth Beach that they be allowed to vote in all elections, but that was not popular, so it was dropped. But still, in special elections, things like tax raising elections, they are LLCs are allowed to vote. Yeah. So you had one individual voting 31 times.
I mean, man, corporations are people according to the Supreme Court, but that really takes it to a whole nother level. You just mentioned Biden there, and I think it's important that I ask you about it. I mean, this is his state. He served as the senator for one of the two senators from Delaware for nearly 2 decades, from the early 70s until he became vice president. He's been called the credit card senator. I think his reluctance to relieve student debt is deeply tied to his ties to these kinds of corporations and credit card companies' moneyed interests. And I also think that Chris Coons, his the current person who holds that Senate seat, and I think Biden has really tried to make him in his image, holds many of these attitudes as well. In your research into Delaware, what was Biden's explicit connection to this kind of industry or Ponzi scheme of LLCs and incorporation, as you discuss, and his attitude towards it?
So I would say that he didn't create the system. I mean, it's been around for over 100 years. But he is very much a creature of the system. So if you look at, as you say, his voting record, and in the book I also talk about his voting record on busing, which is related to attitudes in Delaware as well, and the more conservative aspects of Delaware's politics around race relations are reflected in its attitude towards corporations as well. I mean, it's no coincidence that states that used to be slave-owning states, like Delaware, tend to be more conservative to when it comes to businesses as well. So that's one aspect. The credit card thing is huge because, as we may have said earlier, 4 out of the 5 biggest credit card companies are located in Delaware. And why? Briefly, because in the early 1980s, Delaware invited 2 of the biggest credit card issuers in to write its regulations to make it more favorable to them, and they got rid of all interest rate caps. Thereby getting rid of all interest rate caps in the whole United States, because any company can just register in Delaware, get around any local interest rate caps. So credit cards are a huge one. But then if you look at who funded Biden's campaign, up until he was running with Obama, his top donors to his Senate campaigns were all the biggest law firms in Delaware that make the rules, that argue the cases, and that collect the fat fees. And so they live on they are parasites, essentially, and creators of this system. And so they are the big movers and shakers in Delaware, and he very much was funded by that system. So he has had no interest in challenging the system at all. But as you said, the other 2 senators, Carper, Coons, have also had no interest in challenging the system. If anything, they might have been more strident in defending some of its more nefarious aspects, such as corporate anonymity, in Congress.
Yeah, Chris Coons at Davos last week, just chilling with Sinema and Manchin. He's one of the people that I think gets flies a little bit under the radar, but fills a very similar role that those 2 do within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So Coons being a great example, everybody's friend, right? Like you said, very much a centrist type figure between the 2 parties. And Biden is similar kind of character. And they have this system in Delaware, which they call the Delaware Way, which officially means to people who like the Delaware Way will say, well, what it means is we all get together on, everyone knows each other, and we get together and we sort things out, which is kind of what Biden has always said. And sometimes it's worked out on Capitol Hill, and sometimes it hasn't. More often, probably hasn't than has. But in Delaware, what it really means is that we all know what we want to do, which is keep this system going. And we're going to write rules behind closed doors. We're going to rush them through the state legislature so there's no proper debate. For example, the way that the corporate code gets made in Delaware is that there's a committee of the Delaware Bar that writes changes to the code every year in secret, gives them to the state legislature, which is a part-time body that has no lawyers in it barely and has no capacity to evaluate these changes. So they basically just rubber stamp them. And then the governor also has no capacity or interest in challenging these or questioning them, and also rubber stamps them. So you have a system where these working lawyers from the Delaware Bar make the rules that they themselves will appear in court under, which could always seem to me like the fox guarding the hen house. So these lawyers are the very ones who've been creating the system, keeping it going. Big law firms based in all around the what used to be called Rodney Square in the middle of Wilmington. And these are the ones who backed Joe Biden for the past 40 years. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's just important, if not uncomfortable, to acknowledge that, because he might have moved past it. He might have been vice president. He might have more progressive people on his staff, but that 40 years of being a creature of that political system is in him still, right? And if you want to understand his instincts or his kind of desires as president, you have to understand that.
I think it's even worse than that. He's proud of it. If you go to White House website and look back on some of the speeches and look up where he's mentioned Delaware, he always says proudly, "We're the corporate state," So he's very proud of Delaware's record as a home of corporations. But the dark side of that is anonymous corporations and all the ways they've been misused for, as I say, from money laundering, international crime, drug smuggling, arms smuggling, people trafficking.